Hi, everyone. Anna here. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar called Energy Shocks from the Iran War, Unpacking the Role of Congress. My name is Anna, and I am the content strategist at Fiscal Note, and I am happy to be your moderator today. Just a few housekeeping items. In case you're not familiar with Fiscal Note, we are an end-to-end policy intelligence solution. We help you track legislation, analyze regulation, and engage your stakeholders at the local level all the way to the global level. In addition to Policy Note, our hero platform, we also offer the trusted reporting of CQ and roll call. That's where our excellent panelists today are coming from. But then we also pair it with the grassroots power of voter voice. So again, it's giving you that end-to-end all the way from tracking legislation to engaging stakeholders and trying to drive outcomes. So now that that is out of the way, I am so excited to introduce our panelists today. We have Caitlin. She is the Capital Power newsletter editor. We have David, who is the environmental energy reporter, and Kelly Livingston. She is transportation and energy reporter. Like I said, all of these wonderful folks come from the CQ roll call side of the house, and we are so excited to have them with us. And just to kind of kick things off, just to remind us all why we're here and what we're talking about today, we're kind of experiencing a perfect storm for U.S. energy costs. Oil prices are surging. We've got higher costs in gas that is hitting transportation, both by car and air. We have a surge in electricity demand, especially with the growth of AI data centers. And there's a lot of bipartisan pressure to act. But how can we act if we have that bipartisan divide? I'd like to turn it over to Kelly to kick off the conversation. Kelly, take us away.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I just want to give us a little bit of an overview of where things stand right now, and we can go from there. So, in the weeks since the US and Israel launched their military campaign in Iran, the global energy market has been in a state of pretty severe supply shock. So that means oil prices have surged dramatically compared to where they started the year. Before the conflict began less than 2 months ago, Brent crude oil was being priced at about $70 per barrel. And as of this afternoon, it's about $98 per barrel. So the impacts of that price hike is already being felt by consumers who are seeing increases at the pump when they're filling up their cars. So if we look at gas prices at the end of February, right before the war began, AAA had the average gas price at about 2.98 per gallon for regular gasoline. Now, that number is up to about $4.02 as of this afternoon. So a dollar plus increase per gallon is already going to hit people's wallets pretty hard, but we're also going to start seeing those costs trickle down through other products as well due to increased production and shipping costs of everyday goods. But despite the impacts to consumer costs, the Trump administration has stood pretty steadfast in its support of the war, with Energy Secretary Chris Wright arguing that Iran has held too much control over the global energy market, and this war is the way to rectify that. That reasoning hasn't really held up so far for Democrats on Capitol Hill, who held Wright in the hot seat during some budget testimony hearings last week and again just this morning. So the Dems have been questioning how aware DOE was about the administration's plans to launch the attack in Iran and how thoroughly they'd analyzed the potential impacts before the US entered the conflict, especially given already increasing pre-conflict costs. So, since the Trump administration took office last January, there's been another seismic shift in federal energy policy. It's the third such swing of the pendulum that we've seen in the last 10 years, with the current administration prioritizing firm baseload power in the form of fossil fuels like coal and natural gas, as well as some nuclear power, while also rolling back federal support for renewables. So there's already been this degree of volatility in federal energy policy that's been making things challenging for an industry that's contingent on planning projects years in advance. And the addition of unexpected international conflicts further complicates the stability of the sector and the resulting prices for consumers. the back on the Hill, it's not really clear how much Congress can actually do at this point to help bring down costs. There's been a few ideas floated, including a national gas tax holiday, supporting drawdowns from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and changing fuel blending requirements to help increase production. But any legislation related to those ideas is going to have a hard time clearing the filibuster threshold in the Senate. And all of this, of course, is happening during a very busy midterm year when Democrats have already begun hammering affordability as a campaign issue, a talking point that's likely to get even more salient the longer that these price hikes last.
Thanks, Kelly. Um, as you mentioned, Secretary Wright's been on the Hill this week and last week, and has another hearing later this week, and with Senate appropriators. And you're right, we are hearing the Democrats just pounding the affordability question, as well as the, where were you before the war question that you mentioned. David, you've studied a little bit about the Democrats' messaging for the midterm. Do you want to talk a little bit about how energy and affordability and the impacts of this war is affecting what they're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Democrats are in a pretty good position going into the midterms as they see it. I don't, you have to separate the politics of every day versus kind of the overall politics. I don't think Democrats are celebrating the circumstances, but they're acknowledging that they're kind of where you would want to be as a party that is in the minority in both chambers and does not have the White House. So Democrats have really started kind of starting last year, really, with kind of looking at where consumer electricity prices were, and then kind of ramping up this year and really kind of, foot on the gas ever since the beginning of the war with Iran. Have Democrats have been focusing on how much consumer energy prices are rising and kind of taking that dissatisfaction and using it to cultivate a message they hope will flip one or both chambers this fall. So Senator Schumer, along with the ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Sheldon Whitehouse, and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Martin Heinrich, have kind of cultivated this pledge on how they're going to address consumer prices. And it's really going after a lot of those Trump administration policies that Kelly was talking about. There, previously there was a lot of talk about climate and reaching climate goals with the actions to kind of boost renewables. Now, the boost in renewables is kind of being positioned as a way to both address consumer energy prices and make American energy less vulnerable to these worldwide shocks we're seeing now. So there was a pledge, building more energy, uh, getting getting it on the grid and getting the transmission infrastructure necessary to ship it, to get it to consumers, making data centers pay for their own energy, which is, becoming an increasingly salient issue for a lot of voters. We've seen, people protesting against data centers in their community because of concerns of energy prices. And, I've heard a lot of Democrats and Republicans compare the position the Democrats are in now to the one that Republicans were in 2022, when they ultimately retook the House. It was a bit of a smaller, Republican wave than they wanted, but they did retake the House. And so we're seeing a lot of the kind of the same messaging. Caitlin and I had a story that just cleared talking about how Maria Cantwell, who's the top Democrat on the Commerce Committee, was hammering the Energy Secretary this morning, kind of saying, like, well, do you think this is okay? Do you think the voters think this is okay? And, Chris Wright kind of had to acknowledge they don't think it's okay, even if they have this message that consumer energy prices are going to come back down. I don't think anyone in the Trump administration likes where they are at the moment, and Trump kind of pushed back pretty harshly when Chris Wright said over the weekend that fuel prices aren't going to come down until 2027. kind of going against his own energy secretary, who maybe had a more kind of real world view of things and was maybe a little more connected to the data than Trump would have liked.
Thanks, David. Also in that story today, you mentioned you were talking about comparing this war with the Ukraine, with the effects of the Russia and Ukraine
Mhm.
conflict that started in February 2022. And Wright, I guess, was sort of pointing to the Biden peaks, the gas price peaks during that period, called it the Biden peaks. And you pointed out that those peaks took 4 months we took 4 months after the
Mhm.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine to get to those peaks. And so, what are you guys hearing about how much longer before we start to see the other side of the effects of this war? And obviously, big question is how long does the war itself go on? But what are you hearing on the Hill about just how much farther ahead members are looking and what are they thinking about?
Um,
Kelly, are you?
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear how long this is going to last. There's not really a great answer to that question because this is a pretty unprecedented situation. It's unclear how long the war is going to last. It's unclear how long the price increases related to the war are going to last. And as David said, there's even been some bickering about that within the administration just this week. So, I mean, the energy experts suggest that the impacts of this are going to last at least months, even if the war ended this month. Like the Energy Administration, Energy Information Administration, which is the data arm of the Department of Energy, put out an analysis earlier this month that said even if the war ends in April, the price impacts are still going to last into next year, which is, I think, what Chris Wright's comments from over the weekend are kind of contingent upon is that data. But earlier this month, the EIA outlook had the estimated price of crude peaking at about $115 per barrel during the second quarter of this year, which is the quarter that we're in right now. And again, that's compared to about $70 per barrel at the start of the war. That price, EIA said, is likely to fall back below $90 per barrel in the fourth quarter of the year and average about $76 per barrel next year. But that's all based on this idea that the war is going to end soon. And after the war ends, the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, which has caused production shut ins for several countries, is going to gradually resume. But the EIA administrator said himself this situation is unprecedented. So we don't really know yet how it's all going to shake out. And he said, quote, in early April, quote, just as we've never seen just as we had never before seen the strait closed, we've never seen it reopen. What exactly that looks like remains to be seen. So even some of the top energy experts within the Trump administration are saying we don't know what the end of this conflict looks like. And that seems to track with what energy experts outside of the federal government are saying that, this is going to last, the impacts of this, even if the war ended today, if it ended this month, it's the impacts of this are going to last for months at least. I haven't spoken to folks on the Hill about what their expectations are, but David, I don't know if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with when you talking to politicians, you kind of have to separate when they're acknowledging what they hope is going to happen and what they actually think is going to happen. I don't think too many people are hopeful that this is going to end anytime soon, even if they're kind of trying to cultivate a message of it not being this long-term thing. Um, Chris Wright, the energy secretary, really hedged that this morning, kind of trying to walk back to 2027. And, I haven't, the Democrats, on the other hand, are very happy to kind of acknowledge this is going to be a long-term thing because they're in a position where they have less to lose by acknowledging the realities of the situation. Um, yeah, it is you know, it took quite a few months for us to understand the true scope of the Russian energy crisis or the crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And, we figure that we're still kind of feeling that wave. Oil tankers move incredibly slowly. So, I've heard kind of people talk about how we're still living in the our present is still influenced by like the past of, 6, 8 weeks ago, just because of how slowly oil tankers are moving.
Mhm.
That's a really good point, David. With all this uncertainty, other than the Democrats being able to try to exploit this as much as they can for their own midterm messaging purposes, what what can we look at? What can the Hill, anybody, what can Congress do to address, especially the energy crisis? Is there anything specific? Maybe you talked a little bit about Schumer's Minority Leader Schumer's sort of manifesto of energy solutions, and maybe you can get into some of those details. And then, one of you can talk a little bit about, it looks like a lot of the power for making any changes in the administration's hands. For
Mhm.
instance, they can release some oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or, they can, keep coal plants open, that kind of thing. They can, what are we looking at for solutions in the short term and or even in the long term?
Yeah, as you're saying, the administration holds kind of what little power there is.
Mhm.
I remember talking to some people during the 2022 energy price rise. These were Democrats, and Biden and was in power at the time. And even they were kind of saying, like, we don't have too much we can do. And but nobody wants the president to go on TV and say, energy prices are high, we can't do anything. Um, yeah, as you mentioned, they did have a release from the Petroleum Reserve, which was coordinated with other nations, other advanced economies. And yeah, so that's going to be ongoing over the next couple weeks. And they also did that in 2022. And an economic study conducted by the Biden administration itself later found that that only had the effect of lowering gas prices about 30 to 40 cents per gallon that year, um, which the Biden administration said was a win. And you know, it is a tangible economic benefit. But if energy or if the price of an unleaded gallon of gasoline goes up to $5 and it was at $3, 40 cents isn't, you're still paying $1.60 more than you would have. Or so, there are other things Congress can do. There's been some kind of murmurings of a gas tax holiday. Other
Mhm.
advanced economies, our neighbors to the North, Canada, have recently instituted one, and others have been considering it within the EU and in Asia as well. That's never been accomplished on the federal level in the United States. It would require legislation, um, but that seems unlikely at the moment. And it could be done at the state level, but not at the federal level. There's been some kind of repositioning of other legislation within Congress as a way to address the war. So there's been this fight over whether fuels that contain a higher amount of ethanol, called E15, farm states have wanted to be able to sell E15 year round for decades. Um, and the legislation they need to do that is probably the closest it's ever been to being passed, but there's still some hangups. But a lot of those farm state people have been positioning that as a way to address rising fuel costs, to say, well, if we can't get oil because of the war from, Kuwait, Iraq, all these other sources, we could at least get an additive to our fuel that's grown in a lot of Midwestern farms. Some other bills I've been covering have been permitting reform. Kind of the largest of which is this Senate bill that we have not yet seen, that's supposedly going is again as close as it's ever been in recent years. That would include a lot of changes to environmental laws, and that's being positioned as a way to kind of address fuel prices, but would likely see longer term benefits. So in the short term, there's really not too much we can do when we're dependent upon a, you know, global commodity that's traded on the global market.
Um, another bill that's on the House floor this week is the and some amendments to the Endangered Species
Mhm.
Act, sort of narrow the scope of it to allow for easier permitting of land that has endangered species on it. And the Republicans on the floor today were pushing that as a way to reduce energy costs because it'll be easier, going back to the permitting, they say that it would be easier to be able to get construction and infrastructure moving better, and that would reduce prices of energy. And of course, the Democrats belittled that argument. But it's just interesting that they are trying to, as you said, trying to find other um, legislative avenues that they can at least tout as energy saving ideas.
Yeah,
Kelly,
kind of
what do
the oh,
you, I know, Kelly, you're our transportation reporter, and
I sure am.
yes, you are. And so what are you hearing on the, obviously we have airline fuel, the surface transportation reauthorization is coming up this year as well, and
Yeah.
that could be a place to add some other legislative items that aren't going to go on their own. What are you hearing on those?
Yeah, I mean, surface transportation is going to be an absolute beast of a bill. It's a 5-year reauthorization. So there are a lot of things that you could tuck into it. And in a year that there's not a lot of must-pass pieces of legislation, it could wind up becoming a vehicle for a lot of different things. But I actually want to go back for a second to the national gas tax holiday proposal, because there was a bill about that earlier this year introduced by Senator Mark Kelly, I believe in early March. And that proposal would suspend the gas tax through the end of the fiscal year. And that's something that could relieve some of the short-term pressure on consumers, but it could have, I think, an unintended longer-term impact on federal transportation concerns because the gas tax is what funds our nation's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and highways. It's something that is included within the surface transportation reauthorization. The Highway Trust Fund, which is supported by the gas tax, has already been losing money for about 20 years now because of increases in fuel efficiencies and the rise of EVs. So possible supplements to the gas tax are already being considered as part of the surface transportation bill because there's not enough money in that fund to maintain the nation's infrastructure already. So I don't know that a proposal to rescind what is left of that fund or what would be going into that fund through October 1st is necessarily going to go anywhere in the Senate in particular, as David said, but I think Congress's options for any sort of immediate relief for consumers are pretty limited, unfortunately. There's not a whole lot they can do to just bring costs down. As you said earlier, Caitlin, a lot of the power remains with the administration. And this notion that David mentioned of E15 getting another push could be true. Chris Wright has been making the rounds on the Hill. And last week, during one of the budget hearings, he said that the DOE has been talking with the EPA about updating fuel blending requirements so that they can produce more transportation fuel. So that could pair very nicely with calls from members for guidance on year-round E15.
What do the oil state members of Congress feel? How do they feel about E15 and the renewable fuel, the push toward expanding that?
There's been some push and pull on that, we did sort of a series of stories on this last fall where there's a little bit of tension between sort of farm states and oil states, if you can kind of divide those members into two camps, because they're representing different interests. Their constituents need different things. They support different industries. So that's sort of a natural tug of war that happens when we're talking about increasing the ethanol blend requirement in the nation's transportation fuel. So they're not, the oil states aren't necessarily going to be as supportive of year-round E15 as a place like Iowa might be.
and a big thing in E15 is kind of the debate. So not I won't get too far into the weeds on this, but there's a debate on how E15 will impact oil refineries and kind of what the biggest concern among the oil state lawmakers, especially those from Wyoming, is how can we make sure that E15 won't just bankrupt refiners and, make the US lose a ton of refining capacity. And this comes at a time when we've already lost a bit of refining capacity and, a lot of Republican members, kind of including Chris Wright this morning, were are kind of lamented the fact that we don't have the refining capacity we once used to have. So that's been the sticking point. They were supposed to act on this by the end of February. And we're in mid-April and we are still very far from a deal. But yeah.
Yeah, and Caitlin, I think you asked this already, but we'd be remiss, I think, if we didn't mention at least that there are some big impacts happening here for aviation as well. So in the same way that oil prices and gas prices are up, jet fuel prices have been increasing since the start of the war. They're up to about 387 per gallon as of yesterday. That's compared to about 250 a gallon before the start of the war, and that's going to trickle down in terms of increased flight costs for anybody who's intending to fly in the coming months. Some companies, some airline companies have already started canceling flights, increasing their fees to adjust for that added overhead cost. And there's been some reporting out of Europe that they're going to run out of jet fuel in the next several weeks, which could lead to even more flight cancellations. And all of that, as the US is going to have a very busy summer for travel, just regular summer travel. But then there are also some major events coming up, like we've got America 250, and also we're hosting the FIFA World Cup. So it's going to be a lot of people trying to fly.
That's a really good point, Kelly. Yeah. Um, okay, Anna, did we have any questions or?
One question that I wanted to pitch is you had talked about, someone had mentioned that there's a bill being introduced on transportation by Mark Kelly. I think that's really interesting. And are there any other moving bills or any other legislation that we should be watching related to all of the various points of energy that we talked about today?
Well, as Caitlin mentioned, this week there's the Endangered Species Act amendment bill that's going to be on the House floor. That's again, it's something Republicans have wanted for years, if not decades, if not since 15 minutes after the Endangered Species Act was passed. Um, so we'll have to see how that develops. It's being pitched as like a way to kind of help energy developers because, a lot of times they want to develop a certain patch of land. There's, an endangered species on it. They don't get to do it in exactly the way they want. So that's kind of the how it's being pitched as a way to address energy. Again, the permitting bill is going to be should be coming up this summer. We don't have bill text. I've been told that staff is like going to be pitching it to senators in the upcoming weeks. So we'll have to see how that develops. And just another thing to keep an eye on is there's a lot of riders going into appropriation season. So we'll have to see if there will certainly be stuff that Republicans put in their appropriations bills to, try to say they're addressing rising energy costs. Um, it's again, it's like the politics of it. They can't just go home to their constituents and say they're not doing anything. So there's going to be, I think, a lot of repackaging of stuff that's already been floated before. But I think in approach this year, we'll also be hearing a lot about that.
That's so helpful. Thank you. That was actually my next question was about riders, and like how some of these amendments are going to make their way through. But we do actually have one last question, which is just in time. This is from Sarah. Any state level proposals of interest?
Well, there have been the gas tax holidays. There was
Mhm.
one in Georgia, and I cannot remember the other state off the top of my head. But I think we could be seeing more of those. Uh, you know, Chris Wright was talking this morning that he was saying California should be doing more to address their gas tax. But as Kelly was saying, if a state gets rid of their gas tax, and a lot of states have balanced budget amendments, can they afford to blow a hole that could be, billions of dollars in their budget. And kind of unlike other gas spikes that can come from, events like Deepwater Horizon or from hurricanes, those disruptions are temporary. This one, since we don't know the ending date, I think it'll be hard for state lawmakers to kind of justify suspending a tax that, if this war is not over in 6 months, but the tax is reinstated, then they're going to be in the exact same position, except they're going to be millions, potentially billions dollar poor.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep, that's actually a good point, is it's proven to be very difficult to reinstate a tax that you drop.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, we have reached our time at 2:30. I want to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful expert insights. It's been a pleasure listening to you. I know I've certainly learned a lot. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
you.
Anna.
Thanks so much.